Hi, this is Matt Malushnik with the Bowling Green State University and the Schmidt-Horst College of Business. Welcome to the Doctorate of Organizational Development and Change Symposium Series. We are a huge fan of Kelly Clarke. She is the founder and lead coach and consultant at Great Lakes Coaching and Consulting. She's also served as a social impact leader for the last 20 years, working in resilience, strategy, performance management, coaching, and development and organizational development. Kelly is also part of the doctoral program for organizational change and development. So we are very honored and excited to have her speaking with us today. So Kelly, thank you so much, and I will pass it on to you.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Good afternoon, everybody. It's so nice to see a bunch of familiar faces and also meet some new people today. Before I share the presentation, I did want to just share a little bit about the DODC doctoral program. So I am in my second year. The program started last year, so I am in cohort 2 and happy to see some cohort 3 folks with us here today. I just wanted to share that for me, it's really been a wonderful experience to be part of an executive doctorate, which is structured in a cohort fashion, to be able to learn from peers in really every sector and really be challenged to apply some academic rigor and understand, how to utilize that rigor in service of the work that we all do. So one of the things that happens in the first year of the executive doctorate program is we are asked to write a paper in the first 2 courses, and we are required to submit that for publication to journal. And so that is not anything I'd ever given any thought to in my entire life. And Dr. Katie is frequently asking us, either as we're progressing in our research or when we're published, to come and share at the symposium. So I'm going to be sharing a paper that I wrote, which relates to my professional experience leading a resilience agency, although I won't get into the details of that today. We just won't have time, but I used it as a case study. And connecting some of the theory that I was able to learn about much more significantly in the program. Thank you, Matt, for sharing that article. For me to be able to learn from the faculty about how to lean into becoming a scholar practitioner, to really understand how to apply rigor to analyzing research and connecting ideas, and then to be able to put something out in the world that's fairly unique and then have the reactions and build community around it, really has been an incredible experience. I've felt very supported by my my peers and my faculty. Robin actually saw my very first draft, which was extremely rough, and was very helpful to me. Robin's on the call today. So I just wanted to share that if anybody's interested in the DODC program. They can certainly reach out to Matt or Dr. Katie to find more about it. So with that, Matt, if you wouldn't mind sharing the deck. So as I mentioned, I'm going to hit on some highlights from a paper published last fall, but my hope is to relate it to so that it's more relatable to a broader audience and provide some value to the folks on the call today, outside of people who might be here because they're interested in appreciative inquiry or post-traumatic growth research. So I'll be touching on practical and implementable steps that organizational leaders and OD practitioners can consider in the types of environment that we find ourselves in today after 24 months of a pandemic. Next slide. So the first thing I want to do is just get us grounded in some of the key constructs. So straight from Merriam-Webster, definition of trauma: a very difficult or unpleasant experience that causes someone to have mental or emotional problems, usually for a long time. Definition of adversity: a difficult situation or condition, misfortune or tragedy. And burnout: exhaustion of physical or emotional strength or motivation, usually as a result of prolonged stress or frustration. And what our conversation today is going to focus on is collective adversity and collective burnout. and what the impact of that can be, and what are some techniques and tools we can use to support our teams and support organizations who are experiencing that. We certainly, are in an environment where that has been front and center for us, not only the pandemic, but other world and international events for what has been a very long time. So I think it's front and center for a lot of folks who are leading in organizations or providing OD services to organizations right now. Next slide, Matt. So how do we usually react? I know some of my colleagues on the Zoom today are very familiar with this, and some might not be so familiar. So normally we're going to react to an immediate threat in one of three ways. We're going to seek to fight that threat. We're going to try to avoid or disengage from the threat, or we're going to freeze. And next slide, please. The reason why we do this, I know a lot of people on the call who I know personally are very familiar with this body of work, but those of you who are not, I'll just give a bit of an overview. There's a rich body of work related to how the wiring of our brain impacts how we respond to stress. I'm just highlighting a really sort of brief highlight here. The term amygdala hijack may be familiar to people. There's all sorts of research on this topic. I have put up one reference for folks who might be interested, which is Daniel Goleman, very well known as one of the thought leaders in social emotional intelligence, because he's often attributed as the person who coined this term, amygdala hijack. So if you're interested, the resource is up on the slide. But, essentially our amygdala is there to help us to be able to respond to immediate threats. From an evolutionary perspective, if we were confronted with a lion, we could quickly ascertain our three choices: fight, flee, or freeze, make a decision about what we thought would be the best choice for us in the moment. In modern day, if we're caught in a burning building, it's going to be helpful to us. But for most modern day stressors, it is not particularly helpful, yet it is something that we are having to acknowledge, and something that gets in our way oftentimes. So it makes it more difficult for us to access our prefrontal cortex, which is where we do our analytical thinking, our system 2 thinking, where we're gathering information, where we're assessing what we don't know, where we're maybe consulting others, maybe we're giving ourselves some time to reflect and making a plan and adjusting. So all of that becomes very difficult in periods of prolonged stress. Next slide. So just to touch a little bit on the consequences of prolonged adversity, loss of motivation, feeling drained or exhausted most of the time, lacking a sense of satisfaction or accomplishment at work, having a sense of failure, having difficulty sleeping or change in sleep habits, withdrawing from coworkers, feeling isolated, being unusually irritable, anxious, or impatient, or in more severe cases, PTSD. So we're going to stop sharing slides for a moment. I'll get back to some of the slides, but we're going to try out a poll on the screen just to get a sense where everybody in the Zoom room is today as they are entering March of 2022. So we are, here we are, 24 months in, the anniversary of the pandemic. And what I'd like folks to do, Matt and I were having a little bit of a technical difficulty. Oh, it's working. Good. Okay. Does anyone need more time?
I think that's it. We got 9 there. Yeah.
Okay. Well, gosh, that's so wonderful to see people, some people feeling recharged and refreshed. That's a really positive thing to see on a Wednesday afternoon in spring. But looks like the majority of the folks who responded were a combination of at mile 13 and a 26-mile marathon, at or reaching their breaking point, or a combination of reaching their breaking point or at mile 13. I did this exercise previously and I didn't have that last option. And a lot of people sort of said, I feel like it varies from day to day, week to week, and month to month. So I added this additional option. I wonder, before we move on, does anyone have any reflections on either doing the poll or seeing the results here, in terms of did it surprise you? Did it make you feel affirmed, or any other reaction?
Hey, Kelly.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's how you look at it too. I was talking to a former employer. She's the former president of a university in Massachusetts, and she said she went to a board meeting that a board she serves on, and they talked about the great reconsideration versus the great resignation. So, it's how you frame, particularly as you look ahead coming out of things here in March 2022. So that was my thought to share, but it
yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that, David. Any other thoughts?
I'd like to know, Kelly, what, if it's possible, what the general public response to this is. Do you have any data that compares this group to others?
No, but no, that would be an interesting survey to put out on LinkedIn.
I would really be curious. And even there, you've got a pre-oriented group.
Yeah. Maybe I'll have a side conversation with Dr. Brodke just to make sure I don't need IRB approval. And it would be something that would be okay to put out there. So I've used it in internally within an organizational setting, but I have not sent it out to a large group.
So I don't want to hijack the conversation, but if you've used it in an internal setting, what comes back? Is this group typical or atypical?
The one time that I used it, there was less reporting of feeling recharged and refreshed. In fact, there was no reporting of that. So yeah, so that is interesting, Carol. Thank you for that, lifting that up. And this is a particular group of people who are interested in how to make things better, and one of the things we're going to talk about today is appreciative inquiry, which might have brought some folks who are interested in that. So yeah, that's an interesting nuance that you brought up there, Carol. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So with that, we're going to have another interactive exercise. Matt is going to put folks into breakout groups of 2, and I will just give you the instructions for them, and he's also going to be putting these in the chat for you. So we'll have 15 minutes in the group, and there'll be groups of 2. One person will be the speaker and the other person will be the listener. So each person will have 7 minutes to be the speaker and the other person to be the listener, and then switch. And so there are 3 questions, which Matt will put in the chat, and that the questions relate to the last 12 to 24 months. The first question is, this was a difficult time for many. How did you experience this time? So the listener asks this question of the speaker. Let the speaker respond, and give them time to respond. Be okay. If there's silences, they might need a chance to think about it. Try to avoid giving any advice or sharing similar circumstances or experiences. Speak only 10 to 15% of the time, or even less if you're the listener. Really, it's just primarily to be asking the question, be providing the space, and giving the floor to the speaker. Use your speaking time to acknowledge and affirm. That sounds hard, that sounds difficult, but not to solve and not to relate a similar experience. Be mindful of not judging another person's experience of adversity. We all, experience adversity differently. And so what might feel quite difficult to one person, those same circumstances might be experienced differently by another. So be sitting in the space as a listener, accepting where the speaker is coming from, and then thank the speaker when they're done, and then they'll switch. You'll switch, and the speaker will become the listener, and the listener will become the speaker. Any questions? This will be, I believe, in a document that you'll be able to access in the chat. Any questions before Matt puts you into breakout rooms? Okay, well, we will see you back here in 15 minutes. So is that document there for them now? I see David unmuted.
Yeah, yes, Kelly was my partner in this, so I'm happy to note this. I'm trying to be a better listener. I'm actually quite loquacious sometimes, so I enjoy being the listener because you had a great story to tell. And kind of what we got from all this is I was learning from Kelly how kind of the COVID paralleled her entry into the DODC program, much like me. And there are a number of learnings, and I think one of them for both of us was sort of this balance in life and trying not to be a perfectionist. Someone else has mentioned that before. A professor in our program who happens to be here today. And so I've been trying to exercise that since the last residency with Dr. Brodke. But good advice and sort of how we balance our professional and personal lives. And I think sometimes you should, we were talking about looking at challenges as opportunities. In Kelly's case, I'm dying to taste this casserole that she learned to cook, Italian casserole. Sounded like she got new skills. And her keep your together bowl for her kids, keep your SHIT together bowl for kids was another kind of trick that she sort of put into play in her household, or a concept that I thought was very useful. I might do the same when my 2 teenage boys come back home. So I appreciated getting to know you better and understanding what you went through. So it was a healthy exercise for me. And I'll go on.
Thank you, David. Anybody else have something they'd like to share before we move on? Okay. So Matt, if you don't mind sharing the slides again. Thank you. So we can move to the next slide. So as I mentioned, we don't have a lot of time today, so I'm really just going to touch on some of the highlights of the topic today. And if you're interested, the article does provide an overview of a lot of these topics, as well as in the reference section, lots of resources of people who've been working on these concepts we're going to talk about for decades. So just a quick sort of introduction to post-traumatic growth research. What I learned from the existing research, which, as I mentioned, has been around since the 90s, is one of the things that was particularly interesting was that Tedeschi and Calhoun, who have done most of the work on post-traumatic growth, they discovered that there were particular enabling factors that were correlated with people who tended to experience growth after adversity or trauma rather than getting stuck or experiencing PTSD. And those 5 factors are listed here, and I'll just briefly go through them. Education being the cognition that what was previously experienced has been disrupted. Emotional regulation being the ability to manage anxiety and confusion, and also the ability to call on resources in your network for support. Disclosure, the ability to talk about the experience and articulate what's happening as it relates to the adversity. Narrative development being a step after disclosure, and that is building the narrative about moving forward and building a narrative around learnings from the experience and about what the desire is moving forward with those learnings. And the final one, which I think is interesting, is service. They found in their interviews that many people shared that participating in service to others or service to a larger cause was influential in helping them to feel that they were able to move towards growth after adversity. And then the other body of work I just like to lift up is a body of work by Dr. Gilpin Jackson, and folks who are involved in the OD network probably know her. She's currently co-chairing the OD network. She's done a lot of work looking at African war survivors from a range of countries. And what she found in her research, she did her dissertation on this topic about 10 years ago and continues to contribute in this space as well as others. But what she found in her research was that war survivors who were able to experience community and tell their personal stories were able to, as she describes it, experience a moment of awakening. And through that telling of those stories and the experience of community, we're able to create transformative learning. So just a quick overview, and then we're going to go to the next slide. How many folks on the call are familiar with appreciative inquiry? Some folks are, some folks aren't. So appreciative inquiry has also been around for several decades, and a rich body of work that is available if this is something that piques your interest. I like this quote on this slide by David Cooperrider, who's one of the thought leaders and founders of this notion, and others. Appreciative inquiry at its heart is about the search for the best in people, their organizations, and their strengths-filled, opportunity-rich world around them. It's not so much a shift in the methods and models of organizational change, but a fundamental shift in the overall perspective taken throughout the entire change process, to see the wholeness of human systems and to inquire into that system's strengths, possibilities, and successes. So I've put up the definition of appreciate and inquire. The source there was Appreciative Inquiry Commons, which is a really rich resource for people who are interested in this topic or appreciative inquiry practitioners. I'm not going to go through those definitions because you can all see them on the slide. So we'll go to the next slide. For those of you who raised your hand that you're familiar with the model, you'll be very familiar with this. And for those of you that this is new, this will be something new for you. So this is the appreciative inquiry model of change. I'm showing you what's called the 4D model. There's a 5D model, which includes definition at the start. But what we're looking at in this model is approaching a change process, and this can be in a team setting, an organizational setting, organization-wide setting, can be a strategy, a way to approach strategy, a way to approach a particular business problem. It can be applied in community settings. The model essentially is a strengths-based approach. So first step being discovering, allowing time to define what is working, the best of what currently exists. Then taking the time to dream and vision what could be, co-constructing that idea, and then destiny being implement, empower, adjust, sustain, and steward. And some of the key principles behind appreciative inquiry is that when we ask questions that seek to identify opportunities, we are more likely, aspirational opportunities, we're more likely to find those answers. When we ask, if we have a strategic planning process or a change process that spends a lot of time trying to understand what's not working, we're more likely to get stuck. And I can tell you, having utilized SWOT for a long time back in the 90s, I was in many meetings where when we got to the weaknesses and challenges, so those strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, so weaknesses and threats, that we spent a lot of time on weaknesses, and we often did get stuck there. So I'm going to go to the next slide now. One of the things that I was, you can go back one, Matt. One of the things I was curious about was, well, given appreciative inquiry is a way to look forward, and post-traumatic growth research suggests the importance of looking backward to make meaning out of what happened. What I was curious about is how could what we were learning from post-traumatic growth research, or what I was learning, how could that be applied in adversity settings when it could be helpful to use appreciative inquiry. And so what I suggested in the paper was that adding a step, which included meaning making. So you can see in the upper right corner of the slide, the meaning making step, that adding this step would be the way to bridge the learnings from post-traumatic growth research with appreciative inquiry. So in meaning making, it's not about getting stuck in what went wrong, but it is about acknowledging and affirming adversity and allowing space and time for people to make some sense of it. So in organizational settings and team settings, it's about leaders or OD practitioners who are facilitating this being comfortable with that and being willing to provide some space and time for that. And then the next slide just shows a different graphic of the same concept, essentially in a collective adversity setting, to allow that time for meaning making, where this activity that Tadishi and Calhoun and Dr. Gilpin Jackson identified as activity that's enabling towards growth, some time for those things to happen, some time for those enabling factors to be nurtured, and then moving through the 4D appreciative inquiry practice. And in my paper, I sort of applied this to a number of projects that the agency that I was leading worked on during the 2008 to 2011 recession and coming out of that. But I won't spend time talking about that today because we're a bit limited. The next slide is a discussion of some implementable practices for leaders and OD practitioners that could be more applicable across different sectors and different situations. So space for generous listening, which is what we did when we broke out in our groups of 2. And those of you who've taken Gestalt will be familiar with some of the techniques that were used, but making sure that we're being active listeners. Providing acknowledgement and affirmation. Leaders and supervisors, particularly now that we've moved much more to a remote environment, making intention to have structure around check-ins, checking in on team members on where they're at with their work, but also being comfortable with checking in with where they're at personally. We've had all sorts of disruptions for parents with schools closed or illness and bus driver shortages. So, folks who are trying to juggle working and childcare at the same time. So really encouraging supervisors and leaders to lean into being okay with having those conversations with your team so that they can feel safe sharing where they're at and what's on their plate. Providing space for meaningful connection with knowledgeable facilitators. I think it can be really helpful in the context of collective adversity to have facilitators who are post-traumatic growth, familiar with post-traumatic growth or otherwise trauma informed, to help facilitate some of the conversations and employ some of the tools. Adjusting expectations of workload and cognitive demand. So I haven't seen any research on this, but I've been reading articles. My partner is a high school teacher, and I often get articles in my feed related to teaching, and I've been reading articles from teachers who are sharing that their students are finding it difficult to learn at the speeds that they were able to learn lessons pre-pandemic. So, just making sure that in organizations we're mindful that if we have team members who have been through significant change, whether or not that's because our own industry has been disrupted, or they've just personally been touched by events like the pandemic, that we can give them some grace with workload and cognitive demand. That speaks to giving people time to recharge and restore. And I'm talking about time more than just making sure people take their vacation they're given, but sometimes there's occasion where we want to give a little bit more time. And to not be the judge of what is adversity. So as leaders, supervisors, and even practitioners, we don't want to judge someone else's experience or feel that maybe we might not feel that was stressful, but we want to understand that it's about how they're experiencing it. And that takes me to the last slide for our conversation today. And I have a couple of thoughts for future research in the article. These items are actually different, and I was thinking about these as it relates to talking to you all today and thinking about what are some learnings that might be more widely applicable across different organizations. And so I know that one thing that can be challenging for leaders and supervisors is this notion of giving people time or adjusting workload and understanding there may be strains on cognitive demand, because leaders and supervisors have goals that they need to meet and business goals. So what I would be curious about is research that looks at whether or not these practices correlate with diminished ability to achieve business targets or increased ability to increase business targets, because I think that would be helpful to understand that. And then the other question I have, which is perhaps more of a conceptual question, maybe less of a research question, but I think a lot of this begs the question, should employee well-being, including a commitment to the enabling practices we discussed in the context of collective adversity in organizational settings, should that be a standalone business goal outside of business targets? Meaning, whether or not we're in a nonprofit environment or private environment, should we value the well-being of our employees as a standalone goal, even if it doesn't increase our ability to achieve our business goals? So with that, I'm going to close my comments and open the floor for questions, reactions, thoughts, contributions, things I didn't think about that maybe others on the call might be aware of.
Kelly, would you like
to research on?
Would you like me to close the slides?
Yes, please. Thank you, Matt.
I would like to make everyone aware of a book called Coddling the American Mind. One of the authors is Jonathan Haidt, and I'll try and get it for you. But it suggests that the less we demand, the less people produce. So I don't know. Many of you are used to me being the Debbie Downer, right? So that shouldn't be surprising. I will get the whole citation and put it in the.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Brodke. Does anyone have personal experience in an organizational setting as it relates to some of those last questions? I know, David, you do a lot of consulting.
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Kelly. Thank you for your presentation. My name is Madison. I did have a comment on the employee well-being question, which I think is interesting, and maybe wanted to understand more about the thought around that question. My work in employee well-being and the thought that I had around it is that it means so many different things to different employers that measurement is just really, it's tough, because what well-being is to one is not necessarily to the other. So, but could you maybe expand a little bit upon like what you think the future research might look like in that as well?
Yeah, well, I was curious about some of the enabling practices that were lifted up in the post-traumatic growth research around giving space to make meaning in the context of collective adversity. So when there has been a circumstance in an organizational setting where there has been a collective experience of prolonged stress, would we anticipate that, because the post-traumatic growth research suggests that being able to make sense of prolonged stress or trauma can lead to growth. So I'm curious, in organizational settings, if organizations were to employ practices, would they see teams being able to to cope with the adversity and the stress in ways in which they might not have been able to prior.
Kelly, I think you directed a question to me and I was thinking, as a consultant, what I find particularly in the healthcare industry is, you have nursing staffs and things. And so employee well-being is very important at the front lines during COVID. But I have read some articles and I have talked with, I deal with mainly leaders that are managing teams that maybe if we spend as much time, at least, so for instance, in healthcare marketing, thinking about using new tools, marketing automation, being productive as we do well-being, we might be more competitive. And that may go a little bit on what Dr. Brodke was saying is we tend to move and shift to these big initiatives and every department gets involved to some degree or another. And I worry a little bit, I don't want this to be labeled a fad because it isn't, or distract in a way that then gets the folks in finance or someone else saying, we got to get back to the basics. So how do you strike a balance? And I think it's generational too. Some of us were raised like, hey, shake it off, go. No one goes to bed angry, but we all did because you didn't communicate with maybe great generation parents. So I applaud you asking these questions, and I think OD&C professionals probably should play a role in how we strike that balance, how we deal with these different personalities, different levels of pain and anguish, and how managers deal with employees and how generationally we deal with that in the workplace. So that's a big nut to crack, unfortunately, but I'm dealing with some of that in team building sessions and trying to advise a chief marketing officer how to run a department and take all these elements into account, but still make the numbers, if you will, because it's budget time. So I hope that makes sense and I answered your question appropriately.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, David. Well, I want to turn it over to Matt because I see we're almost at the top of the hour to close this out for today. But thank you, everybody, so much for coming and giving me an opportunity to share some of the work that I've been able to do in the DODC program.
All right, thank you, Kelly. And I'm going to stop the recording now.